Desertification, I think, should be a contested term. Um, we can see in different studies, like this one by Roy Behenike and Michael Mortimer, that uh, actually it's a term that carries a lot of kind of baggage. And in their study here, they prefer the boring term dryland degradation. And they've been pointing out that um, despite what the kind of the consequences of the Sahel in North Africa, the so-called desertification crisis in the Sahel in the 70s, and the resulting studies that kind of contest this idea. Um, Despite that, the same kind of patterns of thinking of that terminology are being repeated again in today's kind of thinking about desertification in Asia. They claim it was a non-crisis or a non-event. I'm just going to read this out. The Sahel crisis, desertification crisis in the 70s, was a non-event for them because if desertification uh, denotes an environmental crisis consisting of irreversible degradation on a subcontinental scale, then the most significant thing about desertification in the Sahel is that it never happened. Localized, even severe land degradation certainly existed in the region and still exists in some parts of it. But uh, despite all of this severe drought and human suffering, this drought was initially seen as a catalyst um, which exposed the deleterious effects of long-term degradation by people. Recent shifts in rainfall patterns have witnessed the regreening of much of the Sahel, and in retrospect, it now seems that the mostly reversible effects of a persistent drought were simply confused with long-term degradation. So that terminology and this kind of this attempt to rethink what this concept means, desertification, desert, what do they actually mean? Um, and taking on using Diana K. Davis's idea, I think our relationship with the understanding of desert has the markings of a complex kind of love-hate relationship informed by what she has called a kind of cognitive bias due to a forest-centric imaginary. Desert should be understood as a concept that carries historical, colonial, and political baggage, in addition to its more recognized ecological significances. Um, the term was popularized by this forest specialist, Edward Percy Stebbing, where he began warning us about the encroachment of the Sahara and how it would attack the world as a kind of silent and almost invisible uh, disease, so to speak. And this led to a joint Anglo-French forestry mission in the 30s that toured parts of Nigeria and Niger to assess the danger of desertification. And from that point on, we can begin thinking of the desert as a kind of menace in terms of the impact of the concept on our kind of ecological but political understanding. And as Diana K. Davis again says, these perceptions uh, continue to kind of persist in our understanding of this terminology. Um, and one example is that in Mandate Palestine, for instance, this Anglo-European imaginary, what she calls an Anglo-European imaginary of deserts and their spread, led the British-run Forest Department to report incorrectly that half of the habitable area of Palestine had become an artificial desert due to overgrazing. The presumed overgrazing in this case, as in so many places around the globe, was blamed on nomads whose actions and movements nearly all governments have wanted to control. So it's kind of like conflict between the sedentary and the nomadic. I think is kind of the understory of the kind of the conceptual idea of a desert. This was in the 40s, yes. Sorry, I don't have the specific date. Have wanted to control. Reducing livestock numbers, how did they treat that? They reduced livestock numbers, sedentarizing nomads, fire suppression, and planting trees were seen as the answers. And such approaches have become nearly the kind of the template that is very much still in application today. And these two, they started as temporary organizations by the UN, but have now become kind of continuous projects. The United Nations Conference on Desertification and the United Nations Convention to combat desertification. Their projects around the world are really in kind of in sync and in line with this same trajectory, where the desert has a perception dating back hundreds of years, which is they assume deserts to be deforested and overgrazed wastelands that hold promise for improvement and productivity. Whereas it's scientifically has been scientifically discussed in numerous papers that actually the movement of livestock, the nomadic way, the movement of livestock from one area to the other is actually the best use of the majority of lands in these dry lands, and is the best use for its flourishing and productivity. So from there we can go to I think a little bit more abstract terrains. The philosopher Michael Marder, in a short text, discusses the desert as a concept that is plagued by abstraction. The terminology itself in English language for him comes from deserted, to desert a place, and they seem, as he says, to be the areas of the world so vacant that they register as little more than black holes on the radars of our concerns. That is why the beings living there too are voided, rendered invisible, disregarded, forced to merge with nothing. But for him, this is due to the problem of abstraction, that the desert is an abstract concept. And his thinking seems to be that the way out of this is to kind of concretize what desert means. Personally, I tend to disagree. I think the desert has to be a combination of both a kind of concrete practice and abstract thought, because there is a kind of unavoidable philosophical component of thinking the desert. In the Tamashek or Tamazek language of North African Tuareg tribes, desert has a different etymology. It doesn't mean to desert. It actually has the same root as solitude. And I think this is kind of proof of how entwined the concept of desert is with a kind of existential philosophical thinking. And from that culture is Ibrahim al-Koni, the Libyan novelist, who has a project. And his project is to kind of develop a philosophy from the desert. And this is a quote from him in an interview. It's not that the desert is desolate or that it's dominated by nothingness. In reality, the desert has everything. The only difference is that a desert is forbidding, inaccessible, unforgiving. It disguises its true nature. To face it, to discover it, constitutes a harsh challenge for those who aspire to penetrate the world. Why? Because it means freedom. Freedom in the sense Kant always talked about. Freedom as the contradiction of nature, where we are used to thinking that we humans have a strong presence in nature, but in the desert, you are excluded from nature. In actuality, you are in the presence of freedom. What is freedom? It means death. And in other texts, al-Koni uses the Arabic term hikam or hikmah, which in English roughly translate into aphorisms, these kind of wisdom sayings that actually kind of the tradition is a kind of Quranic tradition. If you read the Quran, it's basically a set of aphorisms structured around the same kind of format as these. Desert, freedom incarnate, freedom, desert, concealed. So this relationship between the concept of freedom and the concept of desert is pivotal for al-Koni. And in one novel, The Fetishists, a character, a sheikh, a leader, comes into a particular desert tribe, and reading this quote, I think is very revealing about how he tries to reveal certain structures that emerge from within the kind of a politics of a desert life. So the sheikh realized that liberty was the most important thing for this group of people. Of course, this is all fictional. It's a novel, but and he studied the psychology of the Saharans till he discovered their Achilles heel and found something they love passionately and value more than any other treasure: liberty. Within days of his arrival, he had popularized this philosophy and focused on divine love as the sole means of achieving liberation. So, what happens here is that he convinces them that instead of freedom, he persuades them that instead of understanding freedom as a roaming from place to place, they should understand it as a kind of roaming in the soul in the name of a kind of divine love. So with that, there's a kind of political aesthetics of persuasion to transform the society, and I think that reveals a very kind of a model that's applicable to politics in general and populism in general, um, whereby he describes the political aesthetics of persuasion in its most elemental or core form of displacement. In this case, the displacement of what desert peoples care about the most, freedom, and its transference from its state of being activated through endless travel to achieving liberation of the soul through divine love. So, that kind of mode of operation, these kinds of points are very important in how he extracts the politics from a kind of nomadic life. Another aphorism from al-Koni is every oasis is a trap, every desert salvation, every island exile, every sea freedom. And from a short story called Tongue, one of the characters says, their company is nothing but a trap that has already been set. Sitting and conversing with others is always a trap. When one sits with others, he has no choice but to surrender to the seduction. His tongue inevitably slips, and his mouth inevitably divulges something it ought not to, something detested by reason itself. Silence, solitude are considered higher in terms of their value, philosophically speaking, than speaking. And there's always this paradigm of sedentary life, urban life, being centered around a form of constant speaking, whereas in nomadic life, speaking is sparse because you meet people less frequently, and structures of community are more dispersed. So when you speak, the idea of speak or speech is much more important. And so what we get in the end is one of the things that al-Koni's combination of thinking freedom kind of traverses these different paradigms of a Sufi paradigm of freedom, of a kind of internal discovery of uh, godly love, so to speak, or perplexity, post-Kantian reason, and a somewhat kind of Deleuzian nomadism. So the desert questions are convictions about relationality, time, space, ecosystems. It can be, as al-Koni claims, an instrument of insight, yet its usages within the canon of artistic discourses and practices don't come close to this possibility. So al-Koni's project is to develop a philosophy through his novels that emerges from the space-time of the desert. The novel can be understood as an intrinsically urban phenomenon. Its time and reliance on cognitive patterns and biases afforded by the relationality of urban life place it squarely within an urban framework. Al-Koni's oeuvre examines time, space, and place in the absence of such relationality. And that's why it has to deal with abstraction also. But we don't get this and I think in how an artistic practices this idea of a desert as an instrument of insight. Rather, we get something that's much more kind of like a dialectics between the space time of the desert and that of the white cube. Um, this is a snippet from a text by Donald Judd, who, of course, established the Marfa site with his sculptures and other artists' work also. And he says the main purpose of place in Marfa, which is a desert place, of course, is the serious and permanent installation of art. I insist on this because um, nothing existing now, despite the growth of activity in museums and so-called public art, is sufficiently close to the interests of the best art. Museums are at best anthologies, and public art is always adventitious. The art and architecture of the past that we know is that which remains. The best is that remains where it was painted, placed, or built. Most of the art of the past that could be moved was taken by conquerors. Almost all recent art is conquered as soon as it's made, since it's first shown for sale and once sold, exhibited as foreign in the alien museums. The public has no idea of art other than that it is something portable that can be bought. So basically, it's this kind of dialectic between the portability of like modern art and museums and the kind of eternal time that the desert allows for these installations, and it's kind of a mimicry of ancient civilization. That's the kind of idea that that is kind of proposed here. Kind of mimicry of ancient civilization is in a contemporary abstract form, of course, is what this blank space, other than the blank space of the Y cube, which Judd and site-specific artists of the era were kind of aiming for. But we also have more contemporary outings in the desert and works in the desert. The Desert X Biennial in the Coachella Desert Valley, an open exhibition space, or the Burning Man Festival in the Nevada desert, which kind of uses the idea of an experience economy. The desert is some kind of authentic, sublime space where one can experience authentic experiences. But it's also in of course a model in history, the vast empty space of the desert, used to erect a monument that has kind of a political significance. And one such monument is the Fausto's Marble Arch, which was constructed during the fascist rule of Libya, in between what today is now the area where the city of Benghazi is and where Tripoli is. And of course, like any form of fascism, it's not stupid because it used all of these different styles, architectural styles, that was a blend of Berber, Tamazight, ancient Egyptian, Roman, and neoclassical architecture together. And of course, the idea is that there was no Libyan architecture that wasn't that was not Roman. It was demolished, of course, by Gaddafi in 1973. And if you read what it says on the actual monument here, "O nourishing sun, may you never see a city greater than Rome." So it's a direct uh, conflict between nomadic culture and urban culture. And of course, the desert now is also seen as a place to experiment with um, future terrains, possible future terrains after the end of our planet, or towards the end of our planet. We have these what we call space analogs today. Um, this one in the Dhofar Desert in the Sultanate of Oman, where they set up the center to kind of as a pretend, so to speak, a pretend Mars environment. So the desert metaphors in al-Koni's work, as a very good commentator on al-Koni's work, Meinrad Khalija, the desert metaphors in Koni's work are predicated upon certain premises. Desert space liberates rationality from schematic enclosures, mechanistic certainties, and dogmatic absolutes. Desert people are free to rethink themselves and their realities. Desert space creates a new language of freedom. Desert people find that the spatial enclosures are conducive to critical reflection that deconditions their freedom. And this leads us to this question that Khalija points out to in his writing, that is directly kind of an interpretation of how one of the kind of questions, one of the maneuvers that al-Koni makes in his thinking. Do we slice out the desert from the world, or the world from the desert? In other words, is the world part of the desert, or is the desert part of the world? Where do we begin from? While the former is the more popular conception, the latter provides us with an orientation that can activate fresh processes of detection, revision, invention, and construction. Or as al-Koni puts it, the desert is an instrument of insight capable of spying out the invisible world. And with this, al-Koni makes a claim on the desert that identifies it as a catalyst for what philosopher Nelson Goodman has called world-making. And as we know, Goodman mentions basically 5 ways of world-making. The construction of possible worlds come through composition and decomposition, of what he calls weighting or reweighting, of ordering, reordering, deletion and supplementation, or deformation. And a good example of this is how al-Koni's novels kind of reorganize and recenter the world with basically a specific part of the Sahara Desert as its center, where normally it's seen as a evacuated, expansive emptiness. It becomes the crossroads for a very complex understanding of the world. And with this, he develops a kind of process of world making. And Eliot Kohler writes, in al-Koni's novels, he sketches a Tawarik landscape whose heart is located somewhere between Ayr, the Hamada Hamra, Gaddamis, and Agadez Sabha, Tamanaraset. And this is the kind of area that I think he's talking about. It is the Acasis range, al-Koni's birthplace, which forms the geographical center of this fictional universe. The in-betweenness of this geography is not accidental, for the center of this world is deliberately situated between diametrically opposing social and philosophical forces. To the south lies a world of myth, magic, and superstition. It is the place where the caravans carrying blue cloth, slaves, and gold originate. To the north lie the distant Arab cities of the coast, and after that, the sea and Europe, of course, a place associated with mechanized technology and warfare. For al-Koni, truth emanates from neither. Rather, it is in the struggle between them, the struggle in the Tawarik center, that meaning is to be found. And so this is the kind of the philosophy that is both situated and extremely localized, concrete, of a concrete place, but through the imagination, imaginary thinking, grapples with this conflictual philosophies of the world, and that's why I think the desert is so important to think about as a concept. So can we then reconsider the term desertification and reclaim it as a way of reweighting, reordering, and recomposing the world, desert first, as an exercise in world making? Thank you.